Hello, BookTube. Recently, Michael K Vaughan achieved a kind of BookTube infamy by suggesting a 500 book challenge. This was grown out of challenges that Ollie at Criminali has made about reading what you own, reading what's actually on your shelf, as opposed to constantly buying new things and never really chipping away at them. The read what you own challenge always left me a little bit out in the cold. Because most of the books that I have in my collection I have read. There's only really a tiny fraction, either new hauls from the Brattle Bookshop or new books from publishers. There's only a tiny fraction that I haven't read. That fraction is actually larger in December than it is at any other time of the year because I don't read new books from the next year in the present year. So there are actually now hundreds of books in my collection that I haven't read. But most of the time, that's a very small number. And they're going to get read. They're going to get read and parsed and written about. So I don't have any worry about it. They're not looking at me and making me feel guilty. So I always looked at the Read What You Own challenge with a little bit of, distant interest. And then Michael K Vaughan did the 500 book challenge, which is to read 500 books you own before you buy a new book. Now, you can still be gifted books. If you've pre-ordered something, you can still get that. But no more going to library book sales or used bookstores and just hoovering up a whole dump truck full of books when you've got lots and lots of books you haven't read. And when Michael first issued that challenge, which he was mostly doing for himself, I don't think he thought he was going to get anybody to join him, and yet people have. When he first issued that challenge, my first reaction was disbelief. It was, oh, come now. Surely no one has 500 books in their collection that they haven't read. Surely that is not true. That could not be true. And I heard from a lot of you who said not only do you have 500, but you have thousands of books in your collection that you haven't read. Thousands of books that you have at one point or another bought, unpacked, and shelved, and that have just been sitting there, unread. Sometimes, some of you told me you have thousands of unread books, and some of them that have been unread for decades. And that, when I started getting testimonials like that from all over the world, that's when I realized that not only was the 500 book challenge completely viable and necessary, but also that when it comes to a lot of people, acquiring books is, as I've often heard people say, a completely separate thing from liking books or reading them. The impulse to just blindly acquire seems to be completely separate. Obviously, if you have thousands of books that you haven't read in decades, you have no intention of reading them. So the whole world, the whole process of buying them, shelving them, dusting them, boxing them, moving them, has nothing to do with reading them. Either way, however you look at it, I now look at the 500 book challenge and think maybe a lot of you should take that challenge. As fun as buying books it can develop into a pathology. If buying books, hunting for them and buying them is fun, yes. But if you are still out there hunting for books and buying them when you have thousands unread in your collection, maybe it's time to stop that and read 500 of the books you already own before you do that. Whether you take the challenge or not, Michael has been going through his books, category by category, genre by genre, just giving a kind of a rundown. Here are some of the books in this genre that I own that I haven't read. And he went through a list like that today, and I thought it was fascinating. I thought I would make a commentary video on it because none of you is safe. I can make a commentary video about anything at any time. You don't know? In fact, as the year comes to an end, I may do it more often. I want to do a commentary video on his video and then make a little addendum of my own. Because the category that he picked this time around was historical fiction. And he starts off with the Waverley novels of Sir Walter Scott, who's on my mind because this week I'm going to reread a massive 2-volume biography of Sir Walter Scott that I just got at the Brattle. And I'm sure that is going to provoke me to reread Walter Scott. I absolutely love this author. He is very much antiquated. Sometimes that happens. I think historical fiction is more prone to it than almost anything except mysteries. it can happen. And when an author becomes antiquated, I would argue that that definitely happened to James Fenimore Cooper. Sir Walter Scott would be another prime candidate. When that happens, it requires an extra amount of work on your part to get into the book, any book by that author, because it's no longer speaking in the idiom of the day. And it's no longer practicing the idiom of the day's fiction. It's practicing the idiom of an earlier age's fiction. I have always maintained that if you're willing to do that for a great old historical novel, you will see why it was great. If you're willing to make that leap, if you look at it and say, "Oh, this is antiquated," well, then you're failing right away at the post. You're not, if you're not willing to grant that amount of effort, then you're never going to learn why millions of people liked this book. You have to be willing to grant both the antiquated idiom of the day, and also in terms of just language, and also the antiquated idiom of the fiction of the day, which is more than just language, right? If there is no real barrier in terms of the idiom, the language of the day, for instance, to appreciating something like Gone with the Wind. There's very much an idiom of the time that you, if you don't get past it with Gone with the Wind, then you will never understand why your mother and your grandmother loved it. You will never feel swept away by it at all, because you will have stopped right at the beginning by noticing and not getting past the fact that the idioms of the times have changed. Same thing is true with Sir Walter Scott. I want to recommend to you very strongly Ivanhoe. Just read Ivanhoe. Give it a try. Open your mind completely to both kinds of idiom and let it wash over you and see if it works. Michael K. Vaughan's next choice was James Clavell. I think he was thinking about one particular James Clavell that was not Shogun. I think it was Taipan or something like that. Clavell is most famous for Shogun, and Shogun rightly deserves a place on a list of any list of great historical fiction. I myself argue that Shogun is by far the most effective thing that he ever did. And I think I know why. I think I have a reason as to why. It's a bit of insider baseball. It's not really that important. But I believe that the staggering, unbelievable, almost incalculable commercial potential of Shogun was known early on at Clavell's publisher. I think it was kind of all hands on deck. Let's polish this till it shines. And I don't get the impression that most of his other books had that kind of loving attention, which might be why they sometimes wander. They sometimes are prone to bloat, that sort of thing. I think that Gaijin is very, very effective as a book. But even there's something elemental about Shogun that just isn't there in anything else that Clavell wrote. I think he knew that. But the third item on Michael K. Vaughan's list was the Masters of Rome series by Colleen McCullough, a series of doorstop Roman historical novels that start with the heyday of General Marius and move on from Marius. Marius has a crippling stroke. He is, we see all of the Roman noblemen of his time. The books are told in sort of episodic fashion. There usually isn't an overarching, really strong plot to any one novel. Instead, it's what happens next as the action of Rome moves from Marius in his heyday to Sulla, and then gradually aims at the ascent of Julius Caesar. But it's a cast of thousands, just thousands. And they are, I think, fairly stodgy in terms of historical fiction. I don't think they'll age well in terms of, having a passionate readership. Colleen McCullough has a very, very odd narrative style as a fiction writer. It's very, very odd combination of folksy and stilted that crops up at the oddest times. The characters in the Masters of Rome series will tell jokes that only a suburban housewife outside of Sydney, Australia, in the mid 20th century would really get. And they're presented just flat on. I think that might be the equivalent of the process that happened with James Clavell, which is that the staggering, almost incalculable commercial potential of Colleen McCullough's novel The Thornbirds was noticed early on by her publisher, who said basically all hands on deck. Let's polish this until it shines. And I don't think that action was taken with these massive, impenetrable Roman historical novels. But they have really good sequences. Every one of them does, even down to the end. Every one of them does. I think they get weaker as they go along, but they are still really, really good. Then the next item on Michael K. Vaughan's list was The Winter King, which is a volume in Bernard Cornwell's trilogy about Arthurian age Britain, where he digs in, sort of scrapes off the mythology and tries to give you what Arthurian age Britain would really have been like. I've never liked this author as much as his fans do, and I've never liked this particular trilogy as much as its fans do. I much prefer his Saxon chronicles, his Saxon stories that start with, with Alfred the Great, when England is the underdog, when England is being invaded and occupied, and there is an underground resistance movement. I think those books lend themselves more to Cornwell's writing ability. He's very good at tight-knit fighting bands of men. He's very good at that. His people like Forster, for instance, is not. His historical chroniclers are often good at one person who has a satellite of supporting characters, but is not a group. And Cornwell does the group really, really well. It really comes out in the Saxon novels, where when you read past 6 or 7 Saxon novels, you are reading only for the group. You don't really care what happens next. And the next item on Michael K. Vaughan's list is not only been a goodie, is the Kent Family Chronicles by John Jakes, about Philippe Charbonneau and his adventures in the New World, where the Kent Family Chronicles starts off with the bastard and moves on from there through the whole of 100 years of American history, and really canonizes a particular gimmick of historical fiction, which is to invent an anonymous kind of everyman, or in this case, a genealogy of everyman, and have them rub elbows and cheeks and other parts of the anatomy with famous people from history. So you're not writing a historical novel like Howard Fast did about Thomas Paine. Instead, you're writing a historical novel about somebody who meets Thomas Paine and meets Benjamin Franklin and is almost at the Battle of Bunker Hill and whatnot. And it has its appeals. That kind of historical fiction has its appeals. That's why it's been so incredibly popular. It's I think, falling out of favor in favor of historical fiction that actually just takes you inside the mind, the heart, and the soul of known historical characters, which has always been the other way to tell historical fiction. The Kent Family Chronicles is probably the pinnacle of the I just happen to be there school of historical fiction. Although the next book on Michael K. Vaughan's list, certainly another contender along those lines, The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, 2 volumes set by Herman Wouk, about World War II, starring one guy whose nickname is Pug and his family, as they, he has good and true, clean-cut boys who are going to become warriors for America, the women folk back at home who worry and have bake sales and whatnot. And it's panoramic because we follow the action into every theater of World War II. And Wouk does a really good job. He pours himself into these books. They are, again, a little formless, but they are just overwhelmingly readable. Just overwhelmingly so. I always wish that I used to have the 2-volume mass market paperback set of Winds of War and the War and Remembrance with great old American cover artwork. I had a mass market set in a box. I had that forever and ever. I wish I still did. I might try to read that in mass market, as doomed as that is. Not everything at Wouk was a success, but when he is on, he's really on. Really, really on. And the Winds of War and War and Remembrance are terrific panoramic views of World War II. There was a miniseries on TV with Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum was absolutely born to play Pug, and does in the miniseries. That was just perfect casting. But the miniseries was weird. It was weirdly casual and kind of dumb. It seemed to want to stress over and over again how unaware all the characters are of how important and serious this thing is that's happening called World War II. two absurd points in the miniseries. I remember I was watching the miniseries when it was originally airing. In the same room, I was watching it with a brother, one of my brothers, and our father, who's still alive at the time. And we're watching the miniseries, and we're all just sort of wheezing and cracking up at some of the weird theatrics of it. And then it struck my brother that one way to sort of produce a sounding board for whether or not this is ridiculous would be to simply ask my father, who fought in World War II. So he turned to him and said, "Was it really like this?" And my father said, "No, it was." And then he said a particular word. He said, "No, this is just, but it's pretty entertaining." Anyway, Michael K. Vaughan's next entry here is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. And I think he probably would also include Bring Up the Bodies and The Mirror and the Light, the second and third book in the series. These are historical novels that have taken the world by storm in the 21st century. They are a trilogy about Henry VIII's jumped up lawyer, first statesman, henchman, fixer, problem solver, Thomas Cromwell. And they're amazingly good. They're amazingly good. I read the excerpt. There was an excerpt that came out, I think in the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books. There was an excerpt from Wolf Hall that came out a year before Wolf Hall came out. And I read it and pronounced at the time that if the rest of the book is like this, it'll be the best Tudor historical fiction ever written. And it was. The rest of the book is amazing. I got the advanced copy. I gobbled it down. I waited and marinated on it. Then I got the finished copy and read it and really hunkered down on it. And I wrote a review. And then the next book came out, Bring Up the Bodies, and I thought there's no way that you can recapture the brilliance of this first book in the second book. The second book it's all about Cromwell, but the second book is Anne Boleyn. And it is just as brilliant. It is an amazingly good book. I reviewed that as well. I think I reviewed Bring Up the Bodies for the Wall Street Journal. I think. Or maybe the Washington Post. And then the third book was The Mirror and the Light, and it is brilliant as well. It's longer than the other two. And I reviewed that as well, I think for the Christian Science Monitor, or somebody. I don't remember who. I've reviewed every book, every one of the three books. And I put them aside for a while, and then I recently got just a year or two ago, I got a Canadian trade paperback of Wolf Hall at the Brattle Bookshop, and decided to read it really slow, hold myself to a chapter or two a day with a pencil, and to see if it would stand up on a mitochondrial level of reading. And it does. Oh my, it does. And then I got Bring Up the Bodies in a Canadian UK trade paperback, and then Mirror and the Light. Just fantastic. They are absolutely fantastic. There aren't superlatives, as I always say when it comes to Wolf Hall. If you can find a book on which Christopher Hitchens and I agree, it's a book that probably deserves your attention. This is one of them. Then the next item on Michael's list had me baffled for a minute, but it technically counts as historical fiction. It's Tanazaki's novel, The Makioka Sisters, which is great. It is, I think, one of the great novels of the 20th century. So, and it's a beautiful trade paperback edition that Michael held up. I don't have any copies of the Makioka Sisters. Every time I find a trade paperback at the Brattle Bookshop, I haul it on this channel, show it, describe it a little, describe how brilliant it is, and sure enough, a whole bunch of you want me to mail it to you. So at the moment, I only have an ebook of the Makioka Sisters. I don't have it in physical form. I'm not sure that I would ever get it in physical form. Why would I bother anymore when I have it in ebook form? Then the next book on Michael's list was Taiko by Eiji Yoshikawa, who wrote Musashi. And Taiko is another big, sprawling historical novel. These are weird. Musashi and Taiko are weird in the American book market in that they are an odd shape. For some odd reason, the publisher decided, forget who the publisher was, but for some odd reason, the publisher decided to make them wider. I think maybe to make them look less intimidating in terms of page count. They're both long novels. But if you were to put them in a normal book, the page count wouldn't expand that much. A third. Americans routinely make bestsellers out of books that long. So I'd kind of like Taiko and Musashi to be reissued at some point or other. A nice reissue in a normal-sized hardcover would be great. And then the final book that Michael mentions is Marge Piercy's novel Gone to Soldiers, a World War II novel that I thought was resolutely average. I once had the exact mass market paperback with the photo cover that Michael holds up in his video, and I'll leave a link to Michael's video, of course. I once had that mass market, and I read it, and it did precious little for me. Precious little. There's barely anything in it that is noteworthy. It is swallowed whole by other great World War II fiction, I think. But anyway, that was Michael's list. And it naturally made me think about a list of my own. And I have a bunch of books that I want to show you, starting with The Last Days of Pompeii by Edward Bulwer Lytton. This is a bad novel. This is when I talk about whether or not you are adjusting to the idiom of the day or the idiom of the literature of the day. And that if you, in order to appreciate why a book was so successful, you really have to do that. Well, when you make that adjustment with this book, you end up with a bad novel. If you translate this, you end up with what a lot of people have said is the worst novel ever written. It's not. The Love Letter by Kathleen Sheen is the worst novel ever written, but this is still pretty bad. But it's bad in such a lovely way. I mean, Bulwer Lytton has become synonymous with bad writing. There's a Bulwer Lytton Prize for bad writing. He is the guy who originated It Was a Dark and Stormy Night. This book does not start It Was a Dark and Stormy Night. It starts off with the immortal line, "What ho, Diomed?" But this is a story of ordinary people going about their lives in the city of Pompeii, and the whole book is premised on the fact that the driving force of narrative tension in the novel is one that none of the characters in the novel are aware of. But you, the reader, are aware of it. You, the reader, are aware that they're living their last day. They're living their last week on Earth. You're aware of exactly when, exactly how they're going to meet their end. And that does lend a kind of pathos to this book. If I came across a really neat hardcover with a dust jacket of this thing, I would probably get it and give it a reread. But when it comes to, when it comes to Roman historical fiction, I wanted to put in another plug for this book. This is Pompeii by Robert Harris, which is the same thing, the same basic premise, which is that you, the reader, know what's going on here, and no one in the Bay of Naples does. But Robert Harris adds one extra dramatic twist here, which is that he introduces a character, a hydrologist from Rome, who has noticed that the aqueducts are failing. That's because Pompeii is shifting. Its earthquakes are causing the ducts and the pipes and whatnot to rupture. This specialist goes to Pompeii in order to investigate what's going wrong and whether or not it's going to affect Rome. So Robert Harris introduces into the story the main character is someone who actually does increasingly have an inkling of what's going on here. He doesn't quite, but increasingly he has a feeling for what's going on. He has a feeling that it's the mountain itself that is the problem here, not saboteurs or anything like that. And it's fantastic. Just fantastic. The best thing Robert Harris has ever written. Even the dramatic gestures that he makes that I once quibbled with, like starting, the epigraph for every chapter is an excerpt from a geology manual about how volcanoes work. And I thought, that might be good as an appendix, but what are you doing, adding this sort of technical detail to the beginning of every chapter? But it does work. That is a very wise choice. As you go on in the book, you become more and more knowledgeable about what's coming. It increases the dramatic tension. So I had to include it. While we're talking about ancient Rome, I'll include this one other thing too. This is not in print anymore. You would have to find a copy, but it's worth it. This is Robert de Maria, and this is his book Claudia. And this is a Roman historical novel about all the great and the mighty in Rome, including Claudia, who was a member of a noble family, the sister of an infamous Roman politician. And Claudia is also the inspiration for a set of infamous poems by the Roman poet Catullus, who is a main character in this book. And I've read pretty much every historical novel set in ancient Rome. This one really stands out for its wit, its worldly wisdom. Just wonderful. A Catullus book. Catullus is a difficult character concept to write about, and here it works perfectly. Just perfectly. I had to include it. Then we'll move on. I want to echo Michael K Vaughan in a couple of points in this list. And one way that I'll echo him is with Eiji Yoshikawa. I strongly recommend Musashi. This is how it came out in the 1970s. I think this was the 1970s. or the 1980s. It came out in these wonderful old mass market paperbacks. I wish I still had a whole set of these. They all had step back covers with original artwork. This breaks up what is one enormous novel into a story of sword fighting and a vanished world that it bears much in common with the world encountered by the main character in Shogun. Just absolutely wonderful stuff. Why this thing does not have a wide variety of great new editions all the time, why this author isn't better known, I have no idea. Then, again, with an echo of Michael K. Vaughan, I of course want to echo Wolf Hall. It is a rare example of a historical novel that was hailed as a masterpiece everywhere in the world. It's a rare example of a book that actually deserved that praise. And I have no shyness at all about attacking monuments like that when they don't merit that praise. But Wolf Hall does. But Wolf Hall put me in mind of other Tudor historical fiction. I had to include this by Carol Brahms and S.J. Simon, No Bed for Bacon. This is just an old mass market paperback. I don't know if this is in print anymore, but it is a comic Tudor historical novel that doesn't take any of the conventions of the genre seriously at all. And as a result, if you have read Philippa Gregory, for instance, The Other Boleyn Sister, or if you've read Wolf Hall and you haven't read this, you're going to chuckle your whole way through this thing because it's just such wonderful winking humor at all the conventions of Tudor fiction. But when it comes to gigantic conventions of Tudor fiction, there are masterpieces, and again, you have to, if you accommodate them, then you will find something to love. And this is one of them. This is by H.F.M. Prescott. This is the Man on a Donkey. And this is a sprawling novel of the Tudor England of Henry VIII. But it has a narrative focus. And the narrative focus is something called the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was a massive uprising in the north that Henry had to deal with. It's actually, the Pilgrimage of Grace is done really well in The Mirror and the Light. Really, really well. Without ever visiting the movement. Cromwell is in London, so he never visits the movement. Instead, it's the effect that it has shaking the powers that be in London right to their roots. As a character remarks in The Mirror and the Lamp, if the reports are true, that at one point the commanders of the Pilgrimage of Grace have 50,000 men under arms, they could take London easily. King and all, they could take London easily. This is not a minor annoyance that you could send the Duke of Norfolk with 1,000 old men to handle. This is a major thing. It was largely sparked by Henry VIII's religious reforms, which included sending lieutenants very much vetted by Thomas Cromwell into every church and cathedral in the country, tearing down all the pretty things, as Robert Bolt puts it oh no, it's not Robert Bolt. It's Anne of a Thousand Days. Tell me, where are those pretty things now? These commissioners went into these churches and monasteries and whatnot, turned out all the holy men and women who lived there and who were well known and loved by their community, and stripped the altars, stripped all the valuables, said this is not the state religion anymore. These things are now blasphemous. That caused a massive uprising of people who wanted a redress of those grievances. They were certain that Henry himself was innocent. They largely blamed Cromwell. That naturally makes for some tense moments in Hilary Mantel's novels. This takes you inside the Pilgrimage of Grace, and it's beautifully done. It's a stately historical novel. It's not light-footed, like, for instance, The Mirror or Wolf Hall or Harris's Pompeii, and it's not humorous, like No Bed for Bacon. It's a very somber historical novel, but it is one of the greatest historical novels of them all. So very much worth being on the list, I would think. Then we'll move to a lighter touch, but very savage. These next two are brilliant and very savage. One is by an author that you have heard me praise on this channel many, many times. His name is James Goldman. He was the author of the play The Lion in Winter. He wrote a novel called Myself as Witness, narrated by Gerald of Wales, which tells the story of King John. Poor, luckless, savage, psychopath King John. It's episodic. It takes you through most of his reign, the horrible moments and events of his reign, and it's gripping. Just gripping. And the same thing is true. King John, of course, is famous because of Robin Hood, right? That he's a weak and villainous king. And that is, in the Robin Hood stories, the weak and villainous king has a henchman, the Sheriff of Nottingham, who is usually viewed as a big oaf, who he's the person in the old black and white movies who's just waiting to get a sword through the belly by Errol Flynn. But the novelist Richard Kluger, I've praised this book on this channel many times before too, I want to praise it one more time. The novelist Richard Kluger took that story and turned it on its head in his novel The Sheriff of Nottingham, which gives the sheriff a name and gives him a personality and makes him the good guy without violating any of the normal tenets of what you would think of the time period. This is so memorable. As good as Myself as Witness is a brilliant novel, this is also a brilliant portrait of King John. Among many other things, a brilliant portrait of King John. If you can find this, if you see, this is the hardcover cover, the dust jacket for the cover, of the hardcover, and it shows up in library book sales for a nickel, 10 cents. Grab it, because it is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Grab you by the throat. Fantastic. Then, when Michael was going over his books of historical fiction, there was a big name that he left out. And I'm sure that his list wasn't meant to be complete or comprehensive, but I love this author too much to leave her off my own list, and that is Mary Renault, the Persian boy in this case. The story of a eunuch who enters the court of Alexander the Great and follows that court throughout all of its major events. So kind of a cousin once removed to the Kent Family Chronicles approach. Bagoas was a real person. The eunuch in question was a real person. We know his name from history, but we don't know anything about him. Here, he provides Mary Renault with the perfect person who is not Alexander or Hephaestion. Instead, someone who was there the whole time, even in the most private moments. This eunuch has one or two things to teach Alexander the Great, if you know what I mean. And it's brilliant. The best Alexander the Great novel that's ever been written. The idioms here that I'm talking about, the idiom of our time, the idiom of the language and all, those are no problem at all. The only problem here is the opening of the book. The only obstacle to you getting in and really enjoying the book is the opening of the book, because the first few pages of the book, Bagoas, of course, is not born a eunuch. He has to become one. And we get, Mary Renault does not pull her punches, and she doesn't look away from how this boy was maimed and sold into slavery. It's a bitter pill to swallow at first. It's meant to show you how wounded a figure he is in every sense of the word, so that you can watch as he is gradually elevated. Mary Renault's Alexander elevates everyone around him. No idea if that was true in reality, but in her version, in The Fire from Heaven and The Persian Boy and even Funeral Games, he can elevate people all around him, and he changes Bagoas in every way. It's a very, very good novel. It also made a squintillion dollars. It was sold 1 million times. Thankfully, it's no attempt that I know of has ever been made to film it. I don't like what I see of the film version of, for instance, Wolf Hall. When a historical novel, the more subtlety it has, the less I'm eager to see it filmed. Because I often mention that the movie and film adaptations of books are better than the books. But a large part of why they are better is because authors are usually really bad at nuance. And screenplays strip all that out. A screenplay has to strip out nuance. Most of it. And if they want nuance to be in the show, they have to add theatrical nuance instead of literary nuance. And most books improve because of that. But if the author is a master of nuance, then I shudder to see it happen. I shuddered at the idea that Mark Halperin's novel, A Winter's Tale, would be filmed. Because it's almost all nuance. And sure enough, the film version was a travesty. And I'm kind of glad that The Persian Boy has not been filmed. This next one, though, well, a version of it has been filmed. You will certainly know the film version, which is so weird that you cannot do anything other than simply accord it classic status. The movie I'm talking about is Zack Snyder's 300. Which is based on a graphic novel by Frank Miller. And if you haven't seen that movie, you just have to see it. It's a Quaalude trip while your skin is burning with flaming gasoline, and you just have no choice but to watch from beginning to end. You don't necessarily have to read Frank Miller's graphic novel. You can if you want. It's got wonderful visuals. But most of the best visuals in the graphic novel are miraculously captured in the movie. The book and the graphic novel and the movie are the story of a brave King Leonidas and the 300 Spartan warriors at the Hot Gates at Thermopylae, facing the endless hordes of the Persians. And that's the subject of many, many, many books, including a couple that are just lamentably awful. But the one I want to add on this list is Stephen Pressfield's novel Gates of Fire. This is phenomenally popular, like almost everything else on my list. Phenomenally popular, especially popular with armed services. There is not an army base, a U.S. Army base anywhere in the world that doesn't have several dog-eared copies of this book. But it's also really, really good. It's Stephen Pressfield really at his best. This is a really good historical novelist, and here he just finds the perfect subject and does it just perfectly. Oh, it's a sighting of the bean. Oh, there we go. Well, there are a couple of little dogs in Michael's video as well, so that seems only appropriate. And then we move to The American West. This is another book that I have praised many, many times. This is Mary Doria Russell's novel, Epitaph. This is her book about the gunfight at the OK Corral. And it is amazing. Poetically done. I've read many, many novels about the OK Corral. It was those of you who aren't American, you might not know your American mythology. It was a gunfight between the Earps and the Clantons, in the little town. In this little town, it was immortalized in a Star Trek episode. It was immortalized in a bad movie with Kurt Russell, and it's had many, many novels. The fight itself lasted like 5 minutes, but it's had many, many novels. It's achieved a kind of mythic status in American mythology, American cultural mythology. And Mary Doria Russell decides to go at it on a very mythological level. She'd already written a novel about Doc Holliday, who's a famous participant in the gunfight at the OK Corral. And here she just extends that. But you don't need to read Doc in order to read this. This is just brilliant on its own. The best OK Corral novel that I've ever read, and I'm a fan of one particular other OK Corral novel, Bloody Season by Lauren Esselman, is a fantastic novel. But this is even better. And then my last entry for this list is a bit of a stretch. It's a bit of a stretch. Like I always mention, it seems weird to make any kind of book list without including the Russians. It just seems wrong to leave them out of any list. They're so weirdly talented when it comes to literature that you kind of want to have a Russian involved in every way. And I was thinking about that when I was making this list. Great Russian historical fiction. I was thinking about all the different candidates. The definition of historical fiction being, technically, according to the Historical Novel Society, a novel in which the main action takes place 50 years before the date in which the novel is published. At least 50 years. In which case, I'm going to include this next book. It's a Russian epic. The only reason that it's not going to be taught in schools, like all Russian epics should be, is because it's nonfiction. But all the artifice of fiction is involved. All the character building and the dialogue and the atmosphere, all of that is, even a dramatic through line, all of it is present in this book. It just happens to be nonfiction. This is by Yuri Slezkine, and it is The House of Government. And it's the story of one gigantic, sprawling apartment complex in Soviet Russia. Had libraries, swimming pool, laundromat, theater, and a lot of state families, the families of state officials, jockeyed for the right to live in this building. And it saw the whole rise and flourishing of the Soviet system. Yuri Slezkine looked at this particular building and thought, there's an epic story there, and boy, oh boy, does he write one. Boy, oh boy, does he do that. I strongly recommend The House of Government. It is huge. It's 1,000 pages long, like all Russian epics are. I strongly, strongly recommend it. It is the exact borderline between histrionic fiction and total historical documentation that, for instance, the Gulag Archipelago would be very much along the same lines. So brilliant that only the Russians could do it and needs to be read, even if you can't neatly categorize it. I would, of course, strongly recommend the American trade paperback. the American trade paperback, I think, will be the only time that I am blurbed on the book in the same space as Tom Stoppard. I'm pretty sure we don't share any other blurbs. And certainly he doesn't. The closest that we come otherwise is my blurb on his biography. But I strongly recommend this book to finish the list of historical fiction, because Yuri Slezkin doesn't make anything up, but there's a sense in which he is trying to inhabit the lived experience of his cast of 1,000 characters. And that is, in part, one of the tactics, one of the jobs of a historical novelist. So I'm stretching the blanket just a little to include it on my list. But there you go. Another immensely long video. Those are some historical fiction masterworks to complement Michael K. Vaughan's video, which I will leave a link to down below. But I'm going to finally shut up. So I will see you later. Thank you, BookTube.